Hey guys, Bud Elliot here. Welcome back to the Cover 3 podcast. This is my summer school series today. I'm talking Oregon. I'm bringing on my buddy Matt Prehm. Matt, what's going on, dude? Duck territory. Got it popping over there. 10-3 season. Dan Lennon killing it for the Ducks, dude.
Yeah, first year for Dan went pretty. I will say entertaining. It was successful, but it also had a couple hiccups. The loss at Washington, the loss to Washington at home was a heartbreaker. Bo Nix got hurt in that game, and then the loss to Oregon State on the road, and then the fashion that they lost that game. Uh, it's still talked about here within the state. It's going to be something that Oregon State fans will hold over Oregon fans' heads for a very long time with how they beat Oregon by basically just running the football every play in the second half. But to bounce back against a good North Carolina team, I should say a solid North Carolina team in the Holiday Bowl, come from behind win. You bring back Bo Nix. You've added a really good transfer portal class. You've added a really good high school and JUCO traditional recruiting class in 2023. You've brought back some key pieces from last year's team, and you go into the last season of the Pac-12 as if we know it, and a loaded Pac-12 season with more than a puncher's chance to win the league. It's going to be a fun 2023 season for Oregon.
No doubt about it. So, offensive coordinator Kenny Dillingham leaves to become the head
Yep.
coach at Arizona State. And I thought Dan Lanning made a pretty nice hire in Will Stein from UTSA. What differences have you heard about or seen so far in how they'll operate things?
Yeah. Dillingham is a very much he is very flamboyant. He's very outgoing. He's on social media cracking jokes. Ultra aggressive play caller. A guy that sometimes last season just kind of went off script with what they were running, and it threw the opponent for a loop, and they put up some big numbers. Will Stein came in, and we've gotten to speak with him one time since his hiring. And in that one interview, Stein talked about how he's inheriting a really good offensive unit, and he's got a really good quarterback. He's got key pieces all around the board, and that his offense isn't that much different from what Dillingham ran at Oregon. And it would also be a disservice to this team and to the players that are currently here that if he came in and made these wide sweeping changes to the offense, even if he wanted to, because he's like, look, things were really good last season here at Oregon offensively. I would be dumb to make wide sweeping changes. He basically said that, paraphrasing a little bit, but that's what he said like right away when the first couple minutes of his interview. So we already know the offense is going to look pretty similar to what Oregon looked like under Kenny Dillingham. He did say he has kind of this rule. He likes taking 8 deep shots down the field, throwing the football per game. He likes to be aggressive, airing it out. We do know Dillingham, I think part of this was maybe personnel that they had at Oregon last year. Dillingham loved the double tight end stuff. I think we could see that pare down a little bit at Oregon in 2023. And that part of that's also kind of personnel wise. Last year, Oregon didn't have a lot of receivers. They had a boatload of tight ends. And this year, it's kind of flip-flopped. Oregon's only got 3. They had 3 scholarships tight ends during spring ball. They added a grad transfer from Chase Kelly from Ole Miss, a guy that has played but has never really been like a full-time starter in his career. Last year at Oregon, they had like 6 tight ends. They've got basically 3.5 right now. We'll see what happens. And one of those guys is a true freshman in Kenyon Sadiq, a freak athlete, high-profile recruit, but he's a true freshman. Terrence Ferguson basically missed all of spring ball with an injury, and Patrick Herbert was the only one healthy all spring and was a returner. And he played his first full year of football for Oregon in his 4 years previous this past fall. So the tight end position has talent. Terrence Ferguson's really good, but he's all out for all spring. And so I think this is going to be a little bit of a move where they're going to use their receivers. They've got a lot of them. Troy Franklin is the star of this group, but he's not going to be the only one. And they've got a really experienced quarterback. So long-winded answer there, and I guess to sum it up, it will look very similar to what they did last year with just some minor tweaks from a personnel standpoint.
And I would imagine tempo would be similar. UTSA was definitely a team that was not afraid to go tempo when they needed to.
Yeah, and he said that he
Sorry.
came out and said like tempo is a big deal. We'll do tempo, but we also need to know like when to slow it down, because he talked a lot about the slow tempo too, of real going really fast and then all of a sudden slowing it way down, and so you'll see the changes of tempo as well.
That makes a lot of sense. Matt, is this receiver room better than last year? They add Trayshawn Holden. They add Tez Johnson from Troy. They do lose Chase Cota and Dante Thornton to Tennessee, who I know we already did our Tennessee episode. They're pretty excited about Dante Thornton there in Knoxville. Is this receiver room better?
I think so. Okay. And I think it's because Troy Franklin's better than what he was going into last season. And the people within the program at Oregon, the people around Troy Franklin, the expectation is that this is going to be his last year. And he kind of turned himself into a receiver who will be in that discussion of, is he going to be a first or a second day receiver, draft pick after this coming season. So he's already your best receiver is already better than when he was the year before. And that's huge. Chris Hudson was a really solid number 2 receiver for Oregon last year. He played primarily in the slot, and they've gone out, the Dan Lanning and his staff, they've gone out and they said, hey, we love Chris Hudson. Chris Hudson is a really good, talented player. He's a productive player for us, but we want more. We want to upgrade this position. And they, like you said, they added Tez Johnson, Bo Nix's adopted brother from Troy, really productive player there, their best player on that team in the receiver room, highly productive guy, blazing fast. They haven't had a guy like this with this kind of explosiveness in a while. It's you don't want to make this comparison, and I'm not making it at all. He's not DeAnthony Thomas. I'm not going to say that right now, but that's the type of speed, the explosiveness that they haven't had at that position. And is he as fast as DeAnthony? No, but just relative terms of explosiveness, that's what Tez is going to bring. And we've seen it in spring ball. We saw it in practice. He's really quick. He's really fast. He's tiny. He's very, very tiny. He's very slight. He's like 150 pounds. But the dude has wheels. And they haven't had a guy that goes over the top. And everyone, when he gets on the field, everyone's like, okay, we got to bring the safety back because this guy can go fast. That will help as well. I feel like Trayshawn Holden and Chase Cota is just a trade. Cota comes in last year, really productive year, best year in his 5-year career in college football at UCLA, one at Oregon. He moves on. He's now on a training camp roster with the Detroit Lions. I think Trayshawn Holden is kind of that replacement for that type of player, and he's probably a better athlete. He's probably a better player. He's more talented, more skilled, and you hope that carries over onto the field. But it doesn't just end there. They went and added Gary Bryant Jr. from USC, a former 4-star recruit. That guy's going to play. He's going to make an impact for Oregon. And then they've got a couple freshmen. Jurion Dickey, a 5-star, is supposed to arrive here in a couple weeks when summer school starts. Ashton Kozart, a 4-star receiver from Texas, elite track athlete, could potentially be running some events at Oregon on the track and field side later on in his career. He enrolled early. He looked really good in spring ball. And then Kyle Casper kind of gets lost in the shuffle. This is like a top 200 recruit in the 2023 recruiting class. And he committed in the summer before the 2022 season and then decided to reclassify and enroll at Oregon a year early. He's now seasoned in the system for weight training and understanding the playbook and all that. So yeah, I think this unit should be better than what they were last year. Is it going to be the best unit in the country? No, it's not going to do that. But they've got a chance to put up some really good numbers, some really special numbers. And from a historical standpoint at Oregon, they've got a chance to be in that discussion for maybe one of the better receiver units they've had in a long time.
Absolutely. On the offensive line, they lose 2 guys who were first-team All Pac-12, 2 guys who were honorable mention All Pac-12. That's a lot of guys to lose. They have aggressively attacked the transfer portal. That they get Stephen Jones back from 2021. I saw he's still on the roster. I don't know if he's going to figure in to the conversation. They signed Josh Connerly, who was a total stud last in the last recruiting class. He's now a sophomore. Am I right to assume that this group takes a step back, or can it be close to what it was last year?
It's funny. We had Alik Terry, Oregon's new offensive line coach, on our podcast about a week or two, or whenever a week or so.
Odds and audibles recording. We got to plug the show. There we go. All right.
Yeah. This summer we had the offensive line coach Alik Terry on, and I basically asked him that question. I said, "Hey man, and the unique thing with Terry is he was a GA under Mario Cristobal with the offensive line, so he recruited some of these guys that are on the team right now that are in their second, third, fourth year with the program. Stephen Jones, he helped recruit Stephen Jones to Oregon. Jackson Powers Johnson, he helped do that. Marcus Harper, he helped do that. So he's familiar with the offensive line. He knows he has a unique perspective where he's technically a new coach, but he knows a lot of these guys. And he was a part of a change in the offensive line group a couple years ago. And I asked him, I was like, hey man, you have 4 starters gone. Stephen Jones is back, but he was hurt for a good chunk of last season. He started the first couple games and then missed, I think, 8 straight games with an injury. But to his credit, Marcus Harper was really good in Jones's place. And when Stephen Jones got healthy, he was instantly put right back into the starting lineup. It wasn't even a question. When externally, everyone was kind of like, oh boy, what do you do with Stephen Jones when he gets back? Because Marcus Harper looks so good in his spot. But it was not even a debate. It felt like Stephen Jones was thrown right back in. He's back, and he's going to be kind of, I guess, the elder statesman, the kind of the guy that you look at as, hey, he's been around the block the longest. This is his 6th year of college football with the Ducks. Let's lean on him a little bit. But I asked Terry, I was like, you got 4 guys gone. How do you do this? And he said, there will be growing pains. There will, this is going to happen. There's going to be 4 guys that are playing a lot of football for the first time in a long time. And he was honest. It's like, look, we'll have mistakes. We won't look good for parts, but the expectation is that our guys are going to be ready to go, and the standard's been set, and we'll be able to replace the guys that are gone in time and reproduce what they did. And the reason why he's so confident is that because he cited 3 years ago, they've gone through the same thing. This is the 3rd iteration of this entire offensive line changeover. Back in 2016, Oregon started 4 freshmen along the offensive line. They were redshirt freshmen, and those guys started 4 years in a row, and they departed. And this group that just left replaced them. And Alik Terry was part of that staff that went through that process of replacing an entire offensive line. It was Big Sala, it was Ryan Walk, Alex Forsyth, and TJ Bass. Those 4 guys all started 3 straight years for Oregon, the 2020, 2021, and then the 2022 season. And so Terry is saying, hey, look, we've done this before. I've done this before. We've gone through a wholesale change along the offensive line. And he's confident that this group will be able to stand up to the standard at Oregon, which when Mario Cristobal showed up, he turned that offensive line into elite. They became one of the better units in the country from a physical standpoint, from a skill standpoint, and from a unit playing together standpoint. And Terry's expectation is he picks up where Adrian Clem left off last year, and that was elevating that group even more. So they've got confidence that they'll be able to be pretty good next year up front. They know that they will have some growing pains early on just because of the sheer number of new guys in there, but they're pretty confident they can pull this off.
They certainly have a fairly easy early schedule in order to accommodate this. I mean, it's Portland State at Texas Tech, which could be tricky. Always tough to go to Lubbock.
It should
Hawaii,
be tricky.
Yeah, I mean, Hawaii, Colorado, Stanford. If they're not 4-1 or 5-0, something has gone seriously off the rails for that start. And so I would expect I think 5-0 is probably your most likely outcome there. That's interesting to hear on the offensive line. Obviously, they have to stay healthy. I mean, I usually ask the question of hey, what spot on this team is like the gap between the starters and the backups is the biggest? I'm going to assume it's offensive line this year, not quarterback. That's kind of everybody's answer if I let them say
Yeah.
quarterback. You know,
I would agree with that. And if there's a reason why this unit doesn't gel, doesn't click, doesn't work, my first one would be health, because Junior Angelau is a transfer from Texas. He missed all of last season with that injury. During spring ball, he was very limited in what he did with Oregon. Jackson Powers Johnson, the assumed heir at center behind Alex Forsyth, he's had injuries the last 2 seasons. He's during spring ball, he was healthy for the most part, but they were careful with him. We mentioned Stephen Jones and his injury last year. He was healthy for spring ball, but at the same time, hey, he had a really serious injury last year that kept him out for 8 games. He also had a pretty big one in 2018, I believe. So there's guys on this team that are currently dealing with rehab from an injury last year, or have previous years of injuries that been tacked onto their belts. And if you're right, like, this is the position where it's the most violent, and you've got to have the depth. And odds are one of these guys is going to get hurt at some point during the season, maybe even 2 or 3. That happens everywhere, and Oregon's depth is going to have to show up in here. And that's why I think they went so hard in the transfer portal. I mentioned Angelau. They added a Johnny Cornelius, one of the top tackles from Rhode Island. George Silva was one of the top JUCO transfers that they could sign this past offseason. I think he's the number 1 offensive tackle, if I remember right. I've got the 24 class right now on my mind. And then, the spring, they went out and they added another transfer, and Nishad Strother, a 2-year starter at Eastern Carolina. So they know they need the depth, and they address that in the portal.
Absolutely. Matt, last question I have for you on the offense. I really appreciate the time today. We'll talk defense next. So last year they had a weird split. Like, their offensive efficiency when they were like even or ahead of the chains was really good. When they got behind the chains, Bo Nix and this offense, despite the really good offensive line and Nix, who's obviously pretty accomplished and a good receiving core, they were not converting at a high level relative to all the other things that they did well. Like, it felt like this was a very like shot play type offense, but then like the actual drop back game, when they didn't have the threat of play action, was lacking. Like, I don't watch enough Oregon to know exactly why that was. I have some ideas. I'm curious, why do you think that was? If you have a theory, and what do you think it'll look like this year?
I do think some of that could be tied to Oregon's inability in the red zone to convert. They had some struggles in that regard last year. And I felt like, just my own thoughts here, this isn't anything that Dan Lanning said, I thought they got too cute in the red zone. Oftentimes that's where we kind of would see some of this off the script type stuff from Dillingham at OC, where they'd run some kind of funky play or a trick play, and it is kind of just like, why are they running that? Go to your bread and butter. And that would then, it would fail, and that would then set them up for a second and long, 2nd and 8, and 2nd and goal from the 8. And now they're behind the 6, they've got to execute, and they just didn't do it. So I would think that's probably a culprit right there. And then, it happened a couple times just off script, like, hey, the run game is clicking. Here we go. Just keep running the football. And all of a sudden they'd come out and they'd go 3 straight plays where they threw the football and trying to catch the opponent off guard. It didn't work. I think it was kind of just some funky play calling, some lack of execution in the red zone. But I think those were things that, knowing when you looked at the offense in 2022 and just how explosive it was, how prolific it was. They had, I think, against Fresno State, the first team offense scored on like 11 straight possessions, I think it was. Against BYU the next week, they did something similar where the first team offense scored like 7 straight drives in a row. That's the type of stuff that you just had to live with for Oregon last year, where they were so good and so prolific that sometimes the way they were calling plays, like it just wasn't going to work, and you were playing the percentages that you were going to get the ball enough times where you could kind of overcome the 2 or 3 drives where you really struggled to execute in crunch time. I also kind of wonder how many of those like failed conversions happened post Bo Nix injury against Washington, because so much of Oregon's success last year was due to Bo Nix having an incredible season. And a lot of teams really struggled with defending his accuracy and with throwing the football, and also his escapability in the pocket. He was really good at evading sacks. First of all, he hardly ever got touched. The offensive line did a really good job protecting him. But then the opportunities that were there for the opponents to get a sack, he got out of them pretty frequently. And then against Washington, he hurt that ankle. He tried to finish the game. He did finish the game against the Huskies. He came back against Utah, but they went exclusive shotgun, and he basically couldn't move. And the offense just went from 4th gear all the way down to 1. And they had very little run game because there was no threat for him to run the ball. They could really press cover because they knew that he wasn't going to escape, and his arm strength was down because he couldn't plant his feet really well. And then against Oregon State, it was the same deal. And then against North Carolina, it was better, but it still wasn't even close to what he was like pre-injury. So I would be really curious. That might be some homework for us this summer, is to dive into that and see where a lot of those failed conversions came from. Was it all year, or was it mostly in November when he was hurt?
That's a great point. Absolutely. So defensively, 60th. I mean, barely in the top half of college football. Like you and I last year,
they were bad.
Yeah, but you called it. I don't know if we can pull the tape, but like last year, you said front 7. I think we're fairly excited about it. Back 7, you said it was sketchy, aside from maybe Christian Gonzalez, who that was a pretty pressure. I went back and watched last year. Like you nailed it. Like secondary is a major concern. There are some reasons for excitement with the defensive line. You were excited about Aumave, right?
Yeah.
Who missed the year with the injury. So they have to replace Kayvon Thibodeau. You hope some guys step up, and then one of the guys you were excited about on the show ends up missing the year. Yeah. Obviously, like that's going to be a problem if you lose a first rounder and the guy that you're expecting maybe to have a greater. I know he doesn't play the same position, but it misses the year. So
he was the first team all league defensive lineman in 2021.
Right. Yeah, and so it's not crazy to think
he's good.
Yeah, right. So he's back. Brandon Dorlus is back. Casey Rogers is back. Keon Ware-Hudson's back. They add Jordan Birch from South Carolina, which I thought was a pretty big get in the transfer portal. The pass rush last year was horrid. Like they really, it was a bad combo to hang that secondary out to dry with that lack of pass rush, and they were kind of hung out to dry. Is there any reason for hope this year with the pass rush?
Yeah, we asked that question during spring ball. Coaches on the defensive side said yes. The reasons why, they said player retainment, guys coming back are pretty good. They're going to be even better in year 2 in the system. Number 2, they felt like they now have better depth at that position. That was like one of the very first things Dan Lanning said, was between start of spring ball this year compared to start of spring ball last year, just the overall depth that they had up front was astronomically better. They have more dudes. They have better body types. They have a lot more different body types up front. So there's a lot of optimism there. And then talent acquisition. I just talked on it there. I think they added, if you add linebackers, edge players, and defensive linemen, just from the high school and JUCO ranks alone, I think the number is like 11 players in 2023. They literally went in and added a bunch of dudes. And then during the first portal session and the second portal session, they went out and they tried to find other guys that could also help up front in that front seven, whether it be a linebacker, whether it be their star position, which is kind of like a nickel linebacker edge type guy. Sometimes they blitz him, or just a straight up, defensive lineman. They've done a really good job of turning over that unit. A lot of players transferred out. A lot of those players, unfortunately, no offense to them, weren't going to play a lot. And they've added some dudes that, whether it's portal guys or high school guys, that the expectation is that they play. I think the optimism here is high, but you also have to be realistic. Like, man, like, let's be real. Like, they were terrible. They were awful last season.
Yeah.
You can't have an awful year, bring back a good chunk of those players, and say everything is just going to be hunky-dory. You're going to be magically just 10x better than you were last year. And they may take huge strides, but it's a case where you got to see it to believe it. And I think my approach is there's some reserved optimism. I like Popo being healthy. He'll make things interesting for Oregon up front from a defensive line standpoint, a former first-team player in the Pac-12 in 2021. Casey Rogers was really good and a surprise addition from Nebraska. He chose to come back for an extra year of college football, to the point where he was so good last year, and it was so out of the blue. When his addition was announced, it's kind of like, depth filler piece. Guy will hardly see the field. And he turned into a regular starter, a guy that Oregon was leaning on. And when he announced he was coming back, it was big news. The program was jacked up because they thought he was probably going to go to the NFL. He was not going to be a third-round draft pick, but he was going to be a guy that was going to be on an NFL roster. He'd hear his name called at some point in that draft. And then Dorless is back for another season. And that's your best player up front. And he won't have to be asked. If Popo stays healthy, they've got Taki Tiamani, who was really good in his place last year. Those two guys will hold their position down at nose tackle. And then you add Dorless, you add Casey Rogers, you add Jordan Birch. They've moved Mace Funa from linebacker to edge, which will help him. His body type, he's more of an edge guy. They've been able to add a couple really good freshman defensive ends. The talent is there. And then I think what will really help the defensive line is they basically reloaded everywhere in the secondary. Kyrie Jackson, part-time starter at Alabama. Tysheem Johnson, a starter at Ole Miss. Evan Williams, a player most people in the college circle thought was going to go pro, was not going to consider a fifth year of college football after starring at Fresno State. And he comes in and replaces his brother, Bennett Williams. And then, they've been able to develop Triquez Bridges at corner. They've got Brian Addison back at safety, Steve Stevens back at safety. Jalil Florence was a talented freshman last year that should see expanded growth in his game. Dante Manning is a former five-star recruit that's healthy now. He's battled injuries his first two seasons. And then a freshman, Cole Martin, son of Demetrius Martin, Oregon's cornerback coach. He looked tremendous in the spring game. And you kind of get every year, you get one or two guys where you don't really, hey, this guy's probably going to play maybe special teams, probably red shirt. It's kind of 50-50. We'll see what happens. And then you see a spring ball play out, and then it culminates with the spring game, and you walk away saying, yeah, that guy's going to have to play. I don't know where, I don't know how many snaps, but he's going to play every game. And that was Cole Martin. It wasn't the guy I was on my radar, like guaranteed to play as a true freshman. But after seeing him in spring ball, after seeing him in the spring game, it's like, I don't know where he's going to play because there's not a lot of reps available because he's got a lot of guys ahead of him that are older, but he needs to play and he'll need to be on the field.
He's one of the last guys that we had in the top 247. So that's encouraging to hear, man. Absolutely. The schedule for Oregon State, or why did I say Oregon State? Excuse me. It really it doesn't hinge on Oregon State, but they have a really tough, in my opinion, backstretch. So they go, when's their bye? It's
like first week of October, I think October 9th or 8th or whatever.
So they get the bye before they start the stretch at Washington, host Washington State, at Utah, host Cal, host USC, at Arizona State, and host Oregon State. So on the positive, they only play 4 Pac-12 road games. Some teams play 5, obviously, when you play the 9-game schedule. So that's always important to note. They do get Colorado, they get Stanford, which I think are probably the 2 worst teams in the Pac-12. Stanford almost certainly. The only real kind of bad-ish team or lower team they miss is Arizona. But the clustering here, I'm curious. Like, I'm wondering if they're going to do a lot of just different pairings and trying out things in those first 5 weeks in order to be ready for that stretch run, so they know who can play. Like, that's a very difficult stretch run that they have there.
Yeah, you got to beat Texas Tech week 2. That game is a nightmare. You're going to be in West Texas late, mid-September. It's a night game. I think it's like a 6 p.m. game. It's probably going to be the biggest game Texas Tech has had there from a non-conference perspective in a while, if not ever. But if you can get through that and you get through Stanford and you're 5-0, things are setting up where you could really have a special season. But like you said, like, that Washington game is tough. And seeing how they torched Oregon's secondary last year and all their key pieces pretty much are back offensively, now that game is played on their home turf. That's scary. That's probably going to be a night game. I would circle that as, I don't know across the country, this one better than I do, the October 14th slate, but that's probably going to be one where it's like, hey, game day might be here. We'll see what happens. Yeah. If both teams show up, like, that's going to be one that's going to be in the discussion. And then Washington State, that game's at home for Oregon. But I don't know if people remember last year, it required
the comeback was crazy.
Yeah, it required like one of the craziest comebacks ever. And that was a game where I think Oregon won by like 2 or 3 points, but Oregon trailed by double digits in the second half, and it required a late touchdown to go up by like 2 or 3 with like a minute or so left in the game. And then Mace Funa pick-sixed it like 4 plays later to put them up by double digits. And then Washington State scored a touchdown with like 1 second to go in the game. That's scary.
I really think the only real game, by the way, that could rival for game day is maybe USC at Notre Dame on that same weekend. But other than that, like Arkansas, Bama, like Auburn, LSU, Ohio State, Purdue, Michigan looks like they're off. A&M at Tennessee, probably not. So, yeah, man, it's going to be really, really exciting. Everybody needs to check out Duck Territory. Fantastic job they do. Also, the Odds and Audibles, which is a great show. Click that QR code on the screen if you guys will, and go check them out. They do a great job. Matt, we'll have to have you back on the show, man.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me, bud.
Enjoyed it, man.